have Peter Hayman, Tim March, Andrew Parkinson, Jeff Braun, Hamish Dickson and James Hunt. And each of those people have a particular perspective that they will focus on around the impact of frost. So we'll open the batting with Peter Hayman. So Peter, if you could start us off, thank you.
Thank you. Is that presentation? Thanks very much. I've been asked to sort of just give this opening, clearing our thinking on what we're dealing with in terms of these radiation frost. So firstly, we should sort of acknowledge that in Australian grains belt, normally conditions are reasonably warm and frost is relatively rare. As we just heard from Canada and America and in Europe, they're dealing with freeze and these large masses of really cold air doing immense damage, and they have to sort of fit their crops between that and so on. We're dealing with a relatively rare event. So a Canadian farmer might actually think us talking about frost is a bit less like us talking about moose attacks or something. I mean, it's sort of not that should happen all the time. But they are, obviously, as you people know, this is something that does happen, and it has these are rare events with very, very major consequences. Partly why that is so is because the actual weather and synoptic events that lead to a frost are also relatively rare. So we need this sort of fairly cool day followed by this incredibly dry air. So a day like today has really dry air. We have a northerly airflow with really dry air. To get a southerly airflow, which is cold and really dry, these really dry dew points and really cold, is relatively rare. Normally, when we get the southerly airflow, it's with moisture. Even if it doesn't give us rain, it's miserable and sort of with higher moisture and so on. So this very dry air. Also, we need these very still nights, this very low wind, so you can just get a little bit of wind with those conditions, and that will change that. And then we need to realise that the actual air at the head height of wheat is much colder than what we measure in the Stevenson screen. So what we measure in the Stevenson screen, that little white box that people will measure temperatures in, the head height air is 2 degrees or more colder than that. And we get cold air pooling, frost pockets, movements of air and build up and rolling this dense fluid of cold air doing even more damage. So if to sort of think about this, just for a brief moment, thinking about weather on the moon, which is the same distance from the sun as the Earth, gets incredibly cold and incredibly hot. Why is that so? It's not because the moon is closer to the sun, it's because the moon has no atmosphere. Sort of Canberra on a Thursday afternoon. So the moon sorry James, the moon we have that, and so what we're moving towards, as I have my one prop here of a globe, if people can see that at the back. So James, I imagine, after insulting Canberra, say you are the sun, okay? So what we are doing is that we are travelling around in a year, and every day during the day, we're getting sunlight, and then at night, we're facing outer space. So if the world was to stop spinning, a whole lot of bad things would happen, would fall off, and a lot of other bad things. But we would also equilibrate with minus 273 Kelvin, okay? So we would get incredibly cold. Anything that stops that is a little bit of atmosphere, a little bit of moisture in the air. Moisture, that's why on a frosty night, if you park your car under a tree, you're not going to get as bad a frost on the windscreen. So anything that can stop that outgoing radiation. So given this radiation situation, what we want to do is to store as much of the incoming radiation from the day before. Which is difficult because there usually, with frost events, there isn't a lot of radiation to store from the day before. But what we want to also do is to minimise the outgoing radiation. And so anything you can do to help with that is going to benefit. So that's why orchardists will want to have sometimes just bare soil that will maximise the incoming radiation and minimise the outgoing radiation. And the soil is a main source of heat at that time. So understanding the basic process of radiation frost is important to think about any agronomic techniques that we can do to solve that, the radiation frost and the pooling of cold air. What happened last year? Last year was, as you know better than I, was an extraordinary year, a year in two halves. Incredibly wet up to July, and then bang, incredibly dry from July. And so we had this sort of this sort of fantastic start, and then in July the tap turned off, and we moved to a really dry spring period. And there's the spring period. It was an extraordinarily dry spring, and obviously any moisture in the system is beneficial to this. Another aspect about August in particular, with these really damaging frost in August, was this incredibly high, this high pressure system, and this anomalously high pressure system. So there's people in CSIRO scientists in Tasmania who are wanting to sort of look at this as one of the most unusual maps you ever see. So in terms of these things, and they're trying to. There's these systems where you can run these weather events through everybody's computer, sort of weather at home and around the world, and they're trying to look at, was this high something that might actually be due to greenhouse forcing? How unusual was it? But it's certainly, for people who look at these maps, this was extraordinary, that high pressure system. And another important aspect of it is the anomaly is sitting in the bight. A question then is can POAMA, if we understand these systems, can POAMA provide any information on the pressure systems that lead to frost and heat in the grains belt? So if we understand what drives some of these systems, can we better understand that? And so this is just very quickly, this is the trajectory of this air. So normally air is parcels of air. This is from James Risby and Peter McIntosh from CSIRO. Parcels of air normally come straight across here. This was coming from the Southern Ocean and descending here. So it was incredibly cold, incredibly dry air on the 2nd of August. This is unusual. This line here is where we get snow, and there was widespread snow in some of these higher peaks through this time. It was an incredible mass of very, very cold and very, very dry air. Steve Crimp's work showing that even though with warming we're expecting higher minimum temperatures, we may be getting more frost. And so this is these areas where we are getting more frost. And worryingly, in some of these areas around here, the frost window is extending more into spring, associated partly with these dry springs and partly to do with the increase in polar air coming in. So it could be that's where things happen. An important other aspect about last year was that the autumn, May in particular, was one of the warmest on record. So the wheat growing faster because of the early autumn. And to finally, just to finish up in terms of our thinking about frost, we need to acknowledge that it is a high consequence, low frequency event. These are hard to get knowledge about, hard to get experience of, hard to predict, and inherently hard to manage. They're the typical things we insure for, but discussions like this are important to share knowledge on these events and to learn from them.
Thank you very much, Peter. Our next speaker is Tim March. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Matt. So I'm going to give an overview of the different research projects that are happening in frost. So Bill mentioned earlier that last year GRDC set up a frost initiative, and that has a range of projects involved in it. So this is an overview of the initiative. So there's three main, research programs within it. So we've got genetics, management, and environment. And the idea here is to integrate these three research streams to come up with better solutions to reduce the impact of frost to growers. So I'll touch briefly on the projects that fit into these, and I've put the names of the key researchers up. So if you have questions about any particular project, feel free to contact them. So starting with the management, this is led by Ben Biddulph over at DAFWA. So there's a few projects within this. There's one major project which is at the top, so that's looking at farming systems to reduce the risk of frost. So that project, it's run across the nation. There's a whole range of different trials happening, from intensive to extensive trials. And it's looking at a range of things from protectant products that you can put onto your crop to try and reduce the frost damage, through to different practices from stubble through to grazing and so on, and looking at how different varieties respond to that. If we look at the environment project, that's still evolving at this point in time, but there's one ongoing project in that's led by Jack up in Queensland, and he's looking at economic modelling of frost events and really the dollar cost of frost in different regions. There's two new projects starting up based out of CSIRO. So the bottom one here I've shown with Steve Crimp, that's really looking at on-farm environmental impacts and trying to monitor frost in season using satellite imaging as well as things like using drones to go across and assess frost within a paddock after a frost event. So moving into the third theme, genetics. This again has a range of projects in it. The top one we've spoken about before, the Australian National Frost Program. I'll touch a bit more on that in a moment. But there's also projects at CSIRO looking at different strategies for controlled environment frost screening, as well as projects to look at maintaining stability in varieties after a frost, how they compensate, and changing crop phenology to better adapt to frost. So I'll just briefly touch on the ANFP, what that's been doing. That's probably one of the longest running projects within the initiative. It's been going for 3 years now, and that's really been about setting up frost screening nurseries across the country. So we've got 3 sites in WA, SA and New South Wales, and we've been benchmarking current wheat and barley varieties for sterility under frost conditions, and the idea then to come up with a rating system for wheat and barley varieties. So just to be really clear what we are looking at in this trial, it is sterility at flowering. So what I've shown here with barley here is quite obvious, a little bit harder to see here in wheat. What we aren't generally looking at is this stem frost, is what we saw last year. So we got to look at it last year, but that's really our first data set that we have on this. So everything I'll talk about now is really based on sterility. So in terms of genetic management options, your best option is actually between species. So this is a comparison between wheat and barley. And this is a subset of events where wheat and barley both flowered at the same frost event. And you can see overall barley is more tolerant than wheat. Here was the August frost event last year at Loxton. So wheat was almost 100% sterile in flowering heads, whereas barley was down around 30%. So that's really your biggest bang for buck in terms of genetic management. Within wheat and barley, there is variation, but it is smaller. So important to note, nothing is tolerant to frost. And we have come up with a preliminary ranking system which will be released shortly. And that's basically ranked Agrilink at the moment as either susceptible or very susceptible. Very clear again to point out that this is based on sterility measurements and not yield. So until we can get that data, you really need to use these rankings in the context of first looking at the highest yielding varieties in your region, and then looking at frost ratings after that. You don't want to be on the back foot with yield before you even get hit by a frost. So all this information is on NBT online. But to put a bit of context into the type of variation that you'd expect to see, I've shown here wheat. So we've got wild catchin, which is our very susceptible benchmark variety. Over 75 events over the past 3 years, that averaged 19.6% sterility. If you take the average of our susceptible category for wheat, that's down to 13.3% sterility. Barley is overall more tolerant. So barks are very susceptible check there, that's 12.5, and our susceptible grouping has an average of 7.1%. Just to note, the VS and in wheat and barley are not related, they're independent, and they're referenced back to the check variety. So just the take-home messages from what I've just shown from the ratings. So overall, barley is more tolerant than wheat. Variation does exist within current varieties in the range of VS to S. But really important, first select varieties based on yield in your environment and other things that are important to your farming system. And then use the frost ratings to really fine-tune your risk management. And in some cases, it may be that the VS varieties are your best option. But overall, combine your genetic management and environment strategies to overall reduce your risk to frost. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tim. We're moving on now to look at more the on-farm impacts of frost and on-farm decisions. And first up there is Andrew Parkinson and then Jeff Braun. So over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Matt. So what I'll go through is, I guess, some of the practical implications of what we might see. So obviously haven't got a lot of time. It'll be a very brief introduction and give you some idea of what we potentially can do. So starting with the frost identification, some of what I see as the management options, and then and choosing the correct option out of those. So the first thing I wanted to go through, which is a bit of a common fault, is when to start looking, and from my perspective it's at sort of minimum 5 days after the frost event. Sometimes it's more obvious than that, but I'll refer mainly to wheat, because obviously wheat's probably the main target and is often the most difficult to assess, in my opinion. So minimum 5 days, preferably 7 to 10 days, and with the really late frosts it can even be a bit longer than that, particularly when you're at that sort of mid-dough stage in wheat. The grain can hang on for quite some time. Where to look, obviously, in the heavy straw patches. They're the dead giveaways most of the time, as was alluded to earlier with the bare ground. That'll radiate more heat out and prevent that. So if you go for the chaff patches or chaff rows, those sort of things, you'll generally find it a bit more readily there. Don't always go for the lowest lying areas. One of the things we've noted in the last few years, which is a bit disturbing, is that we've often quite find it further up the rises as well, which is a bit of a different to what we would have seen traditionally. So make sure you check the stems down the bottom there. You'll quite often see that sort of lightening, and it'll be quite soft in there. And also check the head if it's a very early one as well. In the barley and pulses, generally the symptoms are a lot more obvious. So moving into the sort of management options as I see them, and I've ranked them into three broad categories, and they are to leave and let it go through to grain, to cut and bale is pretty obvious, and then grazing, which I'll touch on each of these as we go through now. So really to leave, it depends on the timing of the event, in my opinion. So if we get the early ones, then cereals we can generally leave, and this is prior to that GS 31, 32, and as Peter alluded to earlier, we had those early frosts in early August this year, and there was a lot of damage, a lot of leaf burning. We did find some stem frosting at that stage, but generally those plants will produce new tillers, and you'll get some level of compensation. And quite often there's not enough structural cell or growth on the actual plant to do too much with it at that stage, unless you pull the trigger fairly early and decide that you're going to graze those crops. Pulses and canola are generally I would leave as well, particularly with the early frost, because they do have the ability to produce more flowers and therefore compensate for yield in that way. The late frosts are obviously the concern. Faba beans will generally be okay. They tend to flower and pod over an extended period of time, and therefore have the ability to keep going. Except for occasionally we'll see that, but that's hopefully only in the top pods. Late frost in lentils is obviously not so good, and we may have to look at, and lentils, peas and vetch, so we may have to look at some other options there. To cut and bale, generally on the later frost events, as I alluded to earlier, you need something structural there to actually bale. So these are generally frosts that occur during flowering and throughout grain fill, and where there's no chance of grain production, Cereals and canola are generally the option here, although we can do beans as well. What we do need to do is assess the grain yield versus hay yield, and particularly grain quality at that stage. Sometimes when you look at barleys and things like that, in our own patch this year we had quite a lot of F3, F4 barley, which is hard to deliver these days, so you really have to not only assess the grain yield but the quality of that as well. And a general rule of thumb, cut more than less. Cutting and baling in pulses is generally not that good an option in my opinion. Beans are okay, but it's very difficult to anchor the pulse crop once you've cut it off. The grazing option, again with later frost events, and generally where there's little or no chance of recovery. And this goes for where hay. I'd look at this option where hay is obviously not an option, and that may be due to things such as contamination, where a farmer or producer is not set up for hay, where there are limited marketing opportunities might be poor colour or whatever, or hay quality issues, where you might get a very late frost, and we found that a bit this year, especially where it was coming fairly dry. The crop dried off very quickly. Fortunately, there was some other parts of the country that had some issues with production, so there was a lot of hay able to move into that area. So. It can be very good quality, which I'm sure Hamish will touch on fairly shortly. And the other thing I put there is spray topping, and that should really be considered depending on your subsequent crop choice, in that if you're planning to take it through to cropping again next year, it's probably a reasonable option to look at, but if you're thinking you might leave it out to pasture, then you can probably just afford to let that one go. So just briefly in summary, positive identification takes a few days, especially in wheat. Assess your options, whether to leave, cut and bale or graze. And my number one rule, if you are going to cut, it's generally better to cut a little bit more, because quite often we'll find that the header gets into those lower lying patches and there's not as much there as we perhaps thought. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Well done, Andrew, and there will be time for questions, obviously, for Andrew and others later. So moving on to Jeff Braun's going to cover off on some on-farm aspects. Thanks, Jeff.
No worries. Thanks, Matt. I've been asked to give a presentation on frost, everything I know about frost in 5 minutes, and as Mick Braun alluded to earlier, he probably thought it was 4 minutes too long, so I'll get into it. So here's this data is available for basically any Met, Bureau of Meteorology weather site throughout South Australia or throughout the country, and basically you've got your yield probability curve here based on time of sowing and your risk of frost. Now, the risk of frost here is classed as a frost during flowering, and as we all know, this year it wasn't the flowering frost that caused damage. There was one in August that caused damage, but probably recovered quite well. But it was the later frost that really caused the damage. So I guess when you're looking at time of sowing, you're really looking to balance your maximum yield versus the risk of frost risk and also heat shock at the end of the day. So really, if you're looking at frost throughout the season, you're probably looking at a line more realistically like that, I believe. So for Karoonda, for example, your optimum time of sowing to minimise both of those risks may be actually in here, when your maximum yield's probably on the 1st of April, but you're looking at sort of 80-90% chance of getting frost damage at that point in time. So this is just, this data is readily available. This is probably my personal experience too, on what's more or less sensitive to frost. The farmers that I work with on top end of York Peninsula just wanted me to reinforce that anyone who's considering growing more lentils this year or putting them in for the first time, not to do it, because they're extremely sensitive to frost. So you just really wanted me to impart that on everyone today. Least sensitive crops, and I mean really, I'm talking in these really frost prone environments, people who get belted 4 years out of 5, they really look to stick to these sort of staple type crops and cut these things when necessary. So just now, I guess yes, we're going to get frosted if we farm in a frost prone environment. So what do we actually do with the varieties that we actually sow? We actually need to be a bit smart about the choices that we make with these varieties and look at how they develop. So everyone knows there's these main drivers of maturity and development of the crop. So really what I'm trying to emphasise is you don't want to plant something that's very temperature sensitive, e.g. axe, which is very hard to see, sorry, axe is up here. but really, really temperature sensitive in the first week of April, for example, to just rush through development and really expose it to that reproductive frost timing. I've sort of pointed out, we had to do a range of frost talks during the year, that we don't have a lot of this type of genetics floating around all that much anymore. So we're looking at yippy, frame, spear type maturity, which are very sort of photoperiod sensitive, and you can plant them quite early and they do mature that little bit later. So just wanted to emphasise that, understand how the varieties you sow develop, because it can actually make a huge difference in terms of your frost susceptibility at the end of the day. This is our Sagat funded trial that we had at the Mid-North High Rainfall Zone this year. So we've got 2 times of sowing. The green bars here, that was sown at the end of March and irrigated. And time of sowing 2 in the orange or yellow bars is sown around about Anzac Day, about the 29th of April. So you can see here, we've got maize wheat at Riverton, which is this site is a 21-inch rainfall environment. It's yielded less than 2 tonne to the hectare. Those August frosts, when we planted maize at this time of seeding, it was out flowering. It was actually into grain fill when it got hit by frost. 80% of that yield is due to regrowth from tillers at the base of the plant. So you can see what the wrong variety choice at the wrong time of seeding can do to impact on profitability. Look at some of these longer season wheats, Beaufort, where is the other one? Wedgetail, Whistler, all fairly good yields at that early time of seeding. So genetics, crucial. So monitoring for frost, how do we go about it? Some people might walk out in the morning and go and visit Yorick and see if his trough's frozen over and, yep, all right, we've had a frost. It's one way of monitoring for it. Another way is pea straw. Just chuck a bit of pea straw outside. That always seems to get a bit of frost accumulated on it in the morning. Another way is a tiny tag or a different temperature logger. The worst thing about these is that you sort of find out about a frost in hindsight. Or you can go with something that's the full bells and whistles with a GPS on it and 3G monitoring, and it sends a text message to your phone. I really believe that that's the way a lot of the farmers we work with are going to go in the future. Just because it's difficult to get out there at exactly the right time. Whatever you do, don't do this. It's not an option. I still remember calling one of the guys up I worked with in the frost-prone area this year, and he said he hadn't been frosted because he hadn't had a look. I mean, that's not an option. So utilise yield maps of frost. So we've got a paddock in the mid-north here. Down this way there's a lake. So the cold air descends there. We've got an elevation map. So your blue colours are high ground, red and pink, your low ground in the paddock. So that was the 2014 yield map from last year. So these areas here have basically yielded nothing. 2013 yield map, fairly similar. So you flick back, fairly similar areas getting belted. I think in this situation it's perfect setup to actually put a shape file on people's cutting machines. Just go around and zap these areas out. Generally, I've found most times you're getting within about 90% of the area that you've actually got belted. Unfortunately, the frost is indiscriminate. Some of these areas are the best yielding parts of the paddock when you don't get frosted. So just a few strategies. Don't include any of your frost-prone areas for forward marketing. It's just bound to come unstuck. Remove crop residues within reason. I don't know whether that'll be discussed further on, but Parky's mentioned in his talk, accumulation of residues can really increase the severity of frost in some of those situations. Roll the paddocks after sowing or early post-emergence. Just get it ready for hay, regardless of whether you're going to get belted or not. Keep good records, yield maps. I've alluded to that. Have a good monitoring strategy. So as I mentioned, those temperature loggers, and it's good to get good at identification or give beer to someone who is, because it's absolutely crucial to get it right. And I'll admit I've made a mistake before. You say a crop's stuffed and it's stem frosted, and it goes on to yield 4.5 tonne to the hectare. So get your identification skills right. And I think really at the base of it, it comes down to this: know your plant available water at any stage during the year, because it's a key decision making tool in terms of your recovery potential of that crop. That's it.
Well done, Jeff. Now, to bring us home is James Hunt. Now, James introduced himself as Dr. Frost the other day. So Dr. Frost, take the podium and yes, James is going to. James has been tackling frost out there head on, so over to you, James.
Thanks, Matt. You can call me Ailsa as well if you like. So 2014 frosts, I'm largely just going to say exactly what Jeff said, but I'm a doctor, so you can trust me. I guess echoing Peter Hayman here as well, 2014 was an unusual event, but it was caused by that warm May as well as the extremely cold August, but those sorts of things are probably going to increase rather than decrease into the future, and you really can't just say it was a one-off and it's not going to happen again, I don't think. But I think the good news is there's strategies that we can look at that help us manage the risk of those sorts of events without really doing us out of closing any doors in terms of profitability. So just quickly to put 2014 in perspective and how that relates to time of sowing, I should point out I got a couple of South Australians to help me out with this. This is farm average wheat yield from Matt McCallum's farm in the upper north since 2009, and what he's done is he's split his sowing program into the first half or the second half, which is this early or later, and this is the period over which the whole program was conducted, and compared average yields at that time. And what you can clearly see is that over time, certainly the front half of it has tended to yield better, but 2014 was the exception, I suppose, where the first half for the first time did not yield more than the second half. The other interesting thing to look at this, which I think is one of the strategies that we really can put into place and do something about this risk, is the sowing windows that he's used. That generally sowing has crept earlier and earlier, and certainly 2014 was the earliest and tightest window that over this period. And I've just asked Matt, he sends his apologies, he's wool harvesting today, he says, but the cultivars that he's been using have had less and less of those genetic holds that Jeff's talking about. So back here he was using Wild Catcham and Gladius, so Gladius is quite photoperiod sensitive, its maturity's delayed. Back down here he's using Mace and Emu Rock. So varieties have got faster, time of sowing's got earlier, and we're at the point now where really a lot of that crop's going in too early. So it's flowering too early and it's being exposed to a lot of risk. I think there's real potential to look at using some of those varieties that are a bit slower maturing if we want to be sowing at the end of April, which there's good reason to. So what do we do this year about managing the risks moving forward? I don't think that time of sowing is really your front line defence. It's not very effective. In 2013 we saw that the same variety sown over a month was all damaged by that late frost in October. So it's not an effective way of managing that risk, and if you're trying to delay sowing and flowering to manage frost risk, you're running into trouble with heat and drought, which are just as damaging as frost. I think your most effective strategies, Jeff's already gone through them. Crop species selection, choosing those varieties, or having species such as barley and oats which are less susceptible in your program, and enterprises. So livestock and pasture is obviously an important part of that, and the ability to make and market hay. And as Jeff also alluded to, matching those enterprises to zones within your farm. So in southern New South Wales, where we've been very badly hit with frosts over several years now, farmers are starting to re-fence their properties based on those yield maps that they've got, and where they can, they're zoning a lot of pasture production, hay, wheat, grazing wheat into those frost-prone areas. So I guess just remember where frost sits in terms of determining yield. So these are some graphs which another South Australian, Bonnie Floor, has been producing as part of her PhD, showing the relationship between wheat anthesis date and grain yield for Lamoureux. So this is that relationship just with APSIM, which doesn't take into account frost, and this line here is when you factor in frost and heat. And what you can see is that frost doesn't really change the optimal flowering date in that environment. It's still the middle of September. It just pegs the yield down a bit. So frost shouldn't really be changing when we have our crops flower, because drought is the main thing driving it, and heat is just important as frost. You can see that the yield declines for as much for flowering late as it does for flowering early. And I suppose the other thing that we need to think about is seasonal variability, in that in very dry years, it's good to have your crops flowering early, but you're trading off frost risk. And I think really all we can really do is aim for the middle somewhere. So in the case of Lameroo, shoot for that around that middle of September with our wheat program. So I guess first thing is know the optimum sowing dates for the cultivars that you have in your farm, in your environment. And don't forget that a spring cultivar is really not very flexible over the period of time you can sow it. They really only have about a 10 to 14 day window, and if you're out of that window, you should be switching to another cultivar, a slower maturing one if you're going early. So yeah, try and keep them within 5 to 7 days of their optimum sow date. And I think, yeah, in southern New South Wales, certainly it's the things that were sown too early and stupidly early that got belted by the stem frost. And there's basically no spring wheat in South Australia in our frosty environments that you can sow before the 20th of April. So if you want to go earlier than that, you really need to be switching to a winter wheat, of which there's not many. So just as an example of sowing dates, I suppose, for different windows, I'll use the mid-north as a bit of an example. So these will wobble around a bit across the state. Your best options for starting in late April are these things that Jeff pointed out with strong photo period. They're sort of suited to that end of April period. Then things with weaker photo period like Trojan and Phantom come in, probably a Sparta in there as well. And mace really, and cobra and the like, really do belong in May. I think I said last year that mace sounds a lot like May, so just imagine there's a Y in there and keep it there. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, James. Plenty of food for thought there. Now, Hamish. Hamish is going to cover off on just a few points around livestock and frosted crops. So thank you, Hamish.
No worries. All right, thank you. This is really going to build, I guess, a fair bit on what Andrew was speaking about from some of the opportunities for using frosted crops from a livestock point of view. The two main areas that I'll be discussing over the next couple of minutes will really be the options for using that frosted crop as a hay resource on farm, so separate to any domestic or export markets that you might have for that, but really using it on farm. And then we'll talk about some of the opportunities for grazing those frosted crops as well. What I'm going to go through is really a little bit on what are the main management decisions that I think a lot of us need to walk through with clients in terms of how we can best utilise those resources on farm. When we're looking at using hay on farm, there's two key things to keep in mind. And this might seem basic, but a lot of the time this is something that I see is missed more often than not. And the first thing to really think about if you've got an opportunity to use hay on farm is to know the quality that you're working with. Even from a very basic point of view of the differences in quality in terms of a cereal hay versus a legume hay, that's really important to know so that you can then start to understand what role and what class of livestock it's going to suit on the farm later on in that year. From that point on, you can actually start to utilise things like feed tests. And I think how quickly we can get results now and how cheaply we can get results now on feed quality makes it a no-brainer to get a feed test done. You know, we see huge variation in the quality of hay, and yes, on the whole, we do see improved hay quality with some of these frosted crops, but the variation is far, far greater than that. Okay, so understanding exactly what the quality is then allows us to work out which direction or how that hay will have a role on farm. Because once you know that, you can start to work through exactly what sort of class of livestock it will be able to suit. So this is a basic table, a very rough table of the different nutritional requirements of different classes of livestock. And if you start to think about the differences in quality of, say, a cereal hay compared to a legume hay, then all of a sudden you can start to see what type of stock that hay will suit and what it won't. If you take a cereal hay, and this is probably what we're going to be mostly dealing with, pick a number. Let's say it's 9.5 ME, so metabolisable energy, and it's 9% protein. If you start to then match that up against the animal requirements, you can see exactly what animals it will suit and which ones it won't, importantly, just as much. So in that sort of situation where we've got potentially ewes that are at maintenance or early pregnancy, no problems at all. Meets their maintenance requirements at that point. But obviously, with a cereal hay and say weaner lambs, it's just not going to hit the mark. Okay, so then you can take the next step to start thinking about, okay, well, if we know it doesn't have the quality that we want, how are we going to fix that? It might be that supplementation comes into the system, or it might be that it's got an alternative use. Okay, so I think whenever you're looking at utilising hay on farm, step through that process and work out what sort of role it has, because then you might start to find that it has greater options than what you first thought. Okay, on that initial example, with something like a cereal hay, it might be that that particular hay that year is ideal for a containment ration, because it suits the whole needs. Okay, nothing else needs to go out if it's good enough quality. Or it might be that it only fills a role with some supplementation through winter on a particular feed type. So it seems basic, but it's something that I see very, very often has been completely missed with the wrong hay being used in the wrong system. If you're looking at grazing a crop, a frosted crop, there's a few things that I think need to be worked through in the same way. Okay? And the first issue that always comes up is infrastructure. Whenever we're looking at grazing these frosted crops, we're talking about very high stocking rates. 100 DSE plus is no problems in these sorts of systems. But all of a sudden that puts pressure on things like your fences, so you need to have either large mobs that you can bulk together to get that sort of stocking rate, or you're starting to get into electric fences to make the paddock size suitable to graze it effectively. The other thing that comes in on infrastructure is your watering points. So there needs to be access to water in those systems. Now, if both of those can be ticked off, then it's not a problem to start working your way down the chain as to how you'd manage it. The other thing to keep in mind with a lot of producers is simply what stock are they comfortable running. Many producers might have just run cattle for years and years and years and years, and if the budgets show that sheep are going to be the most profitable option, it's probably still not the way you're going to go. Because these systems are highly productive and they can be very, very highly profitable, but because they're at such a high production mark, the risk is very high as well. If the growth rates aren't achieved that you're looking for, then all of a sudden the budgets go out the window. So make sure the stock that producer is comfortable running is what they go with at the end of the day. The spray topping side comes in, and from my point of view, separate to the agronomic way, one of the key things is working about when you're going to use it. So if you're able to graze a frosted crop immediately with lots of stock and it's going to be used within the next 3 or 4 weeks, there probably isn't too much point spray topping it. But spray topping it can be a very, very effective way of storing some of that feed quality for later in the year. So if you want that as a feed resource throughout the summer, then there's probably a good opportunity to spray top it. The only reason that you may not is that if you do have the chance of getting some reasonable grain recovery, and if you're looking at grazing it with sheep as opposed to cattle, then you can actually leave that as a standing feed resource for later in the year. Okay, and that grain in the head will actually provide some very good quality feed for those lambs or ewes for later in the year. But then it becomes a balance between would you have harvested or not anyway. From the nutritional point of view, there are a couple of important things to have to take into consideration. Obviously, if there is any grain recovery there, then you need to be a little bit careful with acidosis, okay, particularly with wheats. Barley is not so much of an issue because you've got grain within the head. You don't tend to have as many issues with acidosis with dropping some stock into it and grazing away. Always watch out for pulpy kidney. Okay, that's the biggest one which will drop animals dead just overnight. Okay. Supplementary feed and whether that's required on these systems entirely comes back down to working out what the nutritional quality of that feed is compared to the class of stock that you want to feed. Okay, so the table before where we're looking at what nutrient requirements they've got will help a lot in terms of whether you have a gap that needs to be made up or not. Okay, and you can factor that into your budget. Okay, and all those factors need to be brought in to work out whether it's a profitable system or not, because it can be highly profitable, but there is a lot of investment in terms of getting stock in as well, so just be conscious of that. I'll leave that there.